By day, he helped teenagers find the food court and elderly shoppers locate the pharmacy. By night, he couldn't stop thinking about the vulnerabilities he'd identified and the response plans that didn't exist. Some skills from his counter-terrorism days never really went away. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden vigilance and extraordinary courage, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Westfield Shopping Center sprawled across 47 acres of suburban landscape, housing over 200 stores, 12 restaurants, and a multiplex cinema that drew families from 3 counties every weekend. On any given Saturday, 15,000 people moved through its corridors, parents pushing strollers through crowds, teenagers meeting friends at the arcade, elderly couples taking their daily walks in climate-controlled comfort away from the summer heat outside. At the main security desk near the central entrance, James Morrison adjusted his radio volume and checked the monitors displaying feeds from 68 security cameras positioned throughout the mall's sprawling complex. At 54, James looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a quiet security guard who'd found steady work after whatever career had come before. Professional but unassuming, helpful but not intrusive, the kind of employee that management appreciated and customers barely noticed unless they needed directions to a specific store. But James Morrison wasn't just a security guard. He was former Supervisory Special Agent James Morrison, FBI Counter-Terrorism Division, with 18 years of service that had taken him from domestic militia investigations in rural compounds to international terrorist cells operating in major American cities. He'd been part of the teams that had prevented attacks on subway systems, dismantled bomb-making operations in suburban warehouses, and coordinated federal responses to threats that never made the evening news because they'd been neutralized before anyone knew they existed. The transition from hunting international terrorists to checking receipts at mall exits might have seemed like a dramatic career change to anyone who didn't understand that both jobs required the same fundamental skill: recognizing danger before it became deadly, identifying patterns that indicated trouble, and maintaining constant vigilance in environments where most people felt completely safe. His FBI career had ended not with voluntary retirement, but with a medical discharge following a coordinated bombing attack in Kabul that had left him with chronic pain, permanent hearing damage, and post-traumatic stress severe enough to make high-stress federal operations impossible. The blast had killed 3 of his team members and hospitalized James for 6 months while surgeons reconstructed his left leg and psychologists helped him process trauma that went far beyond physical injuries. The FBI had offered desk assignments, consulting positions with private security firms, and training roles at the academy, but James needed something completely different. A quiet job where he could use his skills without the constant pressure of life and death decisions, where the biggest crisis might be a lost child or a minor medical emergency. Westfield Shopping Center had provided exactly that kind of environment for 6 peaceful years. The most challenging security issues were usually shoplifting incidents involving teenagers, minor disputes between customers over parking spaces, and the occasional medical emergency when elderly shoppers overexerted themselves walking the mile-long corridors. It was routine work that had allowed James to heal from nearly 2 decades of living in a world where every day brought new intelligence about people who wanted to kill as many Americans as possible in the most spectacular ways they could devise. But old habits died hard, and James couldn't help analyzing Westfield's security vulnerabilities with the same systematic approach he'd once used to assess federal buildings, airports, and critical infrastructure facilities for potential terrorist targets. The mall had multiple entrances that couldn't be simultaneously monitored by a limited security staff of 8 guards covering different shifts. Emergency evacuation plans that assumed orderly behavior and clear exit routes, but made no provisions for panicked crowds or deliberate attempts to block escape paths. Communication systems that depended on mall management coordination rather than law enforcement protocols. Crowd control barriers designed for managing normal customer flow that would be completely useless in actual emergency situations. Most concerning of all, Westfield's security protocols were designed exclusively for ordinary problems: shoplifting, medical emergencies, minor disputes between customers, occasional teenage misbehavior. Nothing in their emergency procedures manual addressed the possibility of coordinated attacks, armed intruders, or the kind of sophisticated threats that James knew were being planned by terrorist organizations every single day in countries around the world. James had been documenting these vulnerabilities in detailed reports that he submitted to mall management every 6 months, along with specific recommendations for security improvements that would address more serious threats without significantly impacting customer experience or operational efficiency. The reports were politely acknowledged, professionally filed, and completely ignored. Upper management was focused on customer satisfaction scores and profit margins, not on preparing for emergencies that had never happened at their specific location. For 6 years, James had watched thousands of families shop, eat, and socialize in an environment that felt completely safe to them but looked like a soft target to anyone with his background. Children running through corridors without adult supervision. Elderly couples sitting on benches in areas with no security coverage. Teenagers gathering in groups near emergency exits that could be easily blocked. Families loading shopping bags into cars in poorly lit parking areas. Every day, James saw potential victims who had no idea that their safety depended on the assumption that bad people wouldn't target their particular mall on their particular shopping trip. It was the same assumption that people made about their schools, their workplaces, their places of worship, the belief that terrible things happen to other people in other places, not to them in the environments where they felt most comfortable. But James knew that terrorists specifically targeted places where people felt safe, where security was minimal, and where maximum casualties could be achieved with minimum resistance. Soft targets like shopping malls were attractive to terrorist organizations precisely because they offered the opportunity to kill large numbers of innocent civilians while creating maximum psychological impact on entire communities. This Saturday morning started like every other Saturday for the past 6 years. James arrived at 7 a.m. to review overnight incident reports, check security camera functionality, and coordinate with the day shift guards who would cover different sections of the mall during peak shopping hours. The overnight security team reported nothing more serious than teenagers attempting to skateboard in the parking garage and a minor vandalism incident near the movie theater. At 8 a.m., James unlocked the security office and began his routine checks of emergency systems, communication equipment, and coordination protocols with local law enforcement. Everything was functioning normally, and nothing in the intelligence briefings he still received through his federal contacts indicated any specific threats to shopping centers in their region. But at exactly 10:47 a.m., James noticed something that made every instinct trained into him during 18 years of counter-terrorism work start screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored. James observed 3 men enter the mall through different entrances within a precisely timed 2-minute window. Individually, none of them would have attracted attention from ordinary security guards or casual observers. They were dressed in normal casual clothing, moved at typical walking speeds, and behaved like regular Saturday morning shoppers browsing for deals or meeting friends for coffee. But James's trained eye caught details that most people would miss, patterns that indicated coordination rather than coincidence. All 3 were wearing lightweight jackets despite the 80-degree weather forecast. All 3 had similar athletic builds and carried themselves with the kind of situational awareness that belonged to people with extensive tactical training. All 3 were conducting systematic surveillance rather than actual shopping, not browsing merchandise, not consulting store directories, not interacting with other customers, but methodically observing security positions, crowd movement patterns, emergency exit locations, and potential choke points where large numbers of people could be trapped. Most significantly, all 3 were carrying shoulder bags that appeared too heavy for normal shopping purchases but were perfectly sized for concealing weapons, explosives, or communication equipment. James reached for his radio to alert other security personnel, then hesitated. If he was wrong, if these were just 3 unrelated customers who happened to enter at the same time and shared similar fashion choices, calling in a security alert would create unnecessary panic among shoppers and staff, probably cost him his job, and potentially result in false arrest lawsuits against them all. But if he was right, if these men were conducting pre-operational reconnaissance for some kind of coordinated attack, then Westfield Shopping Center was about to become the target of exactly the kind of sophisticated threat that their security procedures weren't designed to handle, and 15,000 innocent people were in immediate danger. James made a decision that would determine whether 15,000 people went home safely that Saturday or became casualties in an attack that could have been prevented by someone who recognized the warning signs. He reached into his desk drawer and retrieved a secure communication device, a piece of FBI equipment that he'd been authorized to keep after his medical discharge for exactly this kind of emergency situation. The device looked like an ordinary cell phone but connected directly to the Joint Terrorism Task Force field office through encrypted channels that bypassed normal law enforcement communications. This is Morrison, badge number 4792, retired status. I have eyes on 3 possible hostile operatives conducting reconnaissance at Westfield Shopping Center, Riverside County. Request immediate tactical assessment and backup. The response came back within 30 seconds, indicating that the task force duty officer recognized both James's credentials and the significance of his alert. Morrison, this is control. Describe specific threat indicators and current operational status. James watched the three suspects through his security monitors as they moved through the mall with systematic precision that confirmed his worst suspicions. They weren't window shopping or browsing merchandise. They were conducting a professional survey of target vulnerabilities. Coordinated entry through separate access points, identical tactical awareness signatures, concealed carry indicators on all three subjects, pre-operational behavior patterns consistent with advanced reconnaissance team. I'm looking at either the most suspicious coincidence in mall security history or the preliminary phase of a major terrorist attack. Understood. Agent Morrison. Federal Tactical Response Team dispatched from regional headquarters. Estimated time of arrival 14 minutes. Maintain surveillance posture and do not engage subjects unless civilians are in immediate lethal danger. James knew that 14 minutes was an eternity in counter-terrorism operations. If these men were advanced scouts for a terrorist cell, they could complete their reconnaissance mission, exit the facility, and return with a full attack team carrying enough explosives and automatic weapons to kill hundreds of people before federal backup arrived on scene. But he also knew that 18 years of counter-terrorism training had prepared him for exactly this scenario, being the first and possibly only line of defense between innocent American families and highly trained operatives whose sole purpose was to maximize civilian casualties in the most psychologically devastating way possible. Through his security monitors, James tracked the three suspects as they moved through different sections of the mall with obvious coordination. Subject 1 had positioned himself near the main food court, where Saturday afternoon crowds would be densest. Subject 2 was surveying the department store anchor points that served as primary emergency exits. Subject 3 was examining the central corridor that connected all major sections of the shopping complex. Their movement patterns indicated professional training in facility assessment. They were identifying optimal positions for explosive devices, escape routes for attackers, and choke points where panicking crowds could be trapped and systematically eliminated. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic terrorism. This was a carefully planned operation designed to maximize casualties and create maximum psychological impact. James activated additional security protocols that most of his colleagues didn't know existed. Using his federal access codes, he began locking down non-essential mall functions and implementing emergency procedures that would give him tactical advantages if the situation escalated beyond surveillance. He diverted security camera feeds to create detailed documentation of the suspect's activities, uploaded facial recognition data to federal databases for immediate identification, and activated emergency communication systems that would allow him to coordinate directly with responding tactical teams without relying on mall management or local law enforcement channels. At 11:03 a.m., Subject 1 made a phone call that lasted exactly 90 seconds. James couldn't intercept the conversation, but the timing and duration suggested operational coordination rather than casual conversation. Immediately after the call ended, all three suspects began moving toward the central area of the mall where the largest crowds were gathering for Saturday afternoon shopping. This was the moment James had been dreading, the transition from reconnaissance to operational deployment. If these men were carrying weapons or explosives, they were about to use them against thousands of innocent people who had come to the mall expecting nothing more dangerous than deciding between different shoe stores. James faced a decision that would define the rest of his life and determine the fate of everyone in the building. He could wait for federal backup and hope that the suspects remained in reconnaissance mode for another 12 minutes. Or he could take preemptive action based on 18 years of experience that told him these men were preparing to kill as many people as possible. Through his radio, James heard routine security chatter from his colleagues, reports about a shoplifting incident at the electronics store, a minor dispute in the parking garage, a request for medical assistance with an elderly customer who'd fallen near the fountain. None of them had any idea that their Saturday shift was about to become a life-or-death situation that would test everything they'd learned about protecting innocent people. James opened a secure drawer in his desk and retrieved items that no ordinary mall security guard was supposed to possess. A service weapon that he'd been authorized to carry based on his federal training, tactical communication equipment that connected him directly to FBI response teams, and emergency procedures that had been developed specifically for terrorist attacks in public facilities. At 11:07 a.m., All three suspects stopped moving and took positions that formed a triangular pattern covering the mall's central area. They were no longer conducting reconnaissance. They were establishing operational positions for a coordinated attack. James activated his emergency alert and spoke directly to the Joint Terrorism Task Force coordinator. "Control, this is Morrison. Subjects have transitioned to operational deployment. I repeat, we are no longer in reconnaissance phase. Request immediate authorization for preemptive tactical intervention." The response was immediate. "Morrison, you are authorized to take any action necessary to protect civilian lives. Federal tactical teams are 8 minutes out, but you are cleared for immediate intervention if civilians are in imminent danger." At 11:12 a.m., James watched through his security monitors as Subject 1 reached into his shoulder bag and withdrew what appeared to be a compact automatic weapon. The reconnaissance phase was officially over. Westfield Shopping Center was now under active terrorist attack, and 15,000 innocent people had approximately 90 seconds before bullets started flying. James activated the mall's emergency lockdown protocols using his federal override codes, sending automated alerts to every store manager while simultaneously sealing non-essential exits to prevent the attackers from escaping or additional operatives from entering the building. The lockdown would also channel fleeing civilians toward exits that James could monitor and protect, rather than allowing panic to scatter them into areas where they could be systematically hunted. "Control, this is Morrison. Subjects are armed and operational. I am implementing immediate civilian protection protocols and engaging primary target. Morrison, Federal Tactical Response is 6 minutes out. Can you maintain defensive positions until backup arrives?" James checked his service weapon and spare ammunition while calculating tactical options that all involved unacceptable risks and minimal chances of success. One man with limited firepower against 3 trained terrorists in a crowded public facility was a scenario that ended badly in every simulation he'd ever studied during his FBI career. But sometimes impossible scenarios were the only ones where heroism truly mattered. Negative. Control. Subjects are positioning for mass casualty event. Civilian protection requires immediate tactical intervention regardless of backup status. James left his security desk for the first time in 6 years with something other than routine mall business in mind. He moved through maintenance corridors that most shoppers didn't know existed, using service routes that would allow him to approach the terrorists from angles they hadn't scouted during their reconnaissance. The emergency lockdown had triggered automatic announcements throughout the mall. "Attention shoppers and employees. This is a security alert. Please proceed calmly to the nearest marked exit. This is not a drill." The announcement had exactly the effect James had expected. Instead of calm evacuation, it created confusion and panic as 15,000 people tried to leave the building simultaneously through limited exits. The corridors filled with frightened families, crying children, and elderly shoppers who couldn't move quickly enough to escape what they sensed was serious danger. This was exactly what the terrorists had planned. Panicked crowds created easy targets and prevented effective law enforcement response. James needed to neutralize the threat before the situation devolved into a massacre that would traumatize survivors and families across the entire region. Through his radio earpiece, James could hear the terrorists communicating in what sounded like Arabic or Farsi, languages he'd learned during his federal service specifically for counter-terrorism operations. They were coordinating positions, confirming weapon status, and preparing for systematic elimination of civilians trapped in the central corridors. Subject 1 had positioned himself at the main entrance to the food court, where hundreds of families were trying to evacuate through limited exits. Subject 2 had moved to the department store junction where emergency exits were being overwhelmed by panicked shoppers. Subject 3 was covering the central corridor that connected all major sections of the mall. It was a textbook terrorist deployment designed to maximize casualties while preventing escape. The attackers would have overlapping fields of fire that covered every major exit route, ensuring that fleeing civilians would be caught in crossfire with no possibility of reaching safety. James reached a maintenance access point that would allow him to emerge behind Subject 1's position. Through a service window, he could see the terrorist preparing his weapon while watching hundreds of terrified shoppers trying to push through the food court exits. Children were crying, elderly people were falling in the crush, and the terrorist was smiling. This was the moment every counter-terrorism agent trained for but hoped would never come. The split second when everything you'd learned about protecting innocent lives would be tested under the worst possible conditions. James kicked open the maintenance door and emerged into the mall corridor with his weapon drawn and federal identification visible. FBI. Drop your weapons and get on the ground. The terrorist spun toward James's voice, raising his automatic weapon toward the crowd of fleeing civilians. James had less than 1 second to make a shot that would save hundreds of lives while avoiding ricochets that could kill innocent people in the crowded space. The shot was perfect, center mass, immediate incapacitation, no collateral damage. Subject 1 dropped without firing a single round at the terrified families who'd been in his crosshairs. But James's position was now exposed, and subjects 2 and 3 were closing on his location with weapons ready and no concern for civilian casualties. The tactical situation had gone from impossible to hopeless, but James had bought precious time for innocent people to escape and for federal backup to arrive. Through his radio, he could hear the sound of helicopters approaching and tactical vehicles surrounding the mall. Professional help was 3 minutes away, an eternity in a firefight, but close enough to give James hope that this story might end with more lives saved than lost. Subject 2 appeared at the far end of the corridor, automatic weapon raised toward both James and a group of teenage shoppers who were trapped between the terrorist and the nearest exit. James had 1 magazine left and 2 targets who were prepared to kill everyone in the building rather than be captured alive. The second engagement lasted exactly 47 seconds and covered a 100-yard stretch of mall corridor filled with terrified civilians who had nowhere to run. James used every tactical technique he'd learned during 18 years of federal service, but he was fighting at a severe disadvantage. The terrorists were willing to kill innocent people, while James had to ensure that every shot he fired protected rather than endangered the families caught in the crossfire. Subject 2 advanced down the main corridor using panicked shoppers as human shields, forcing James to hold his fire while automatic weapon rounds shattered storefront windows and sent civilians diving for cover behind inadequate barriers. A group of teenagers huddled behind a decorative fountain that provided no real protection, while an elderly couple tried to shelter their grandchildren near a coffee kiosk that wouldn't stop rifle bullets. James flanked left through a jewelry store, moving between display cases while the terrorists' attention was focused on the corridor. The store's employees had evacuated, but James could see a young mother with 2 small children trapped in the back office, too terrified to move while gunfire erupted just outside their hiding place. The tactical shot required precision that belonged in sniper manuals rather than close-quarters combat. James needed to eliminate the terrorist without hitting any of the civilians being used as shields, while positioned at an angle that would prevent ricochets from endangering the hidden family. 1 bullet, 1 chance, with dozens of lives depending on perfect execution under impossible conditions. The shot dropped subject 2 instantly, but the sound revealed James's position to subject 3, who had been maneuvering through the department store section. James heard running footsteps and tactical communications indicating that the final terrorist was moving to flank his position while James's attention was focused on protecting the civilians in the corridor. Through his radio earpiece, James could hear federal tactical teams breaching the mall's outer entrances, but they were still 2 minutes away from reaching the central area where the final confrontation would determine whether this attack ended with minimal casualties or became a massacre that would traumatize the community for decades. Subject 3 appeared at the department store entrance with a different weapon, not an automatic rifle, but what appeared to be an explosive device designed to kill everyone within a 50-yard radius. The terrorist was no longer trying to escape or complete a coordinated attack. He was prepared to detonate a bomb that would collapse part of the mall's structure and kill hundreds of people rather than be captured alive. This was the scenario that James had trained for but hoped never to encounter. A suicide bomber in a crowded public facility with no possibility of negotiation or tactical delay. The terrorist had his hand on the detonation trigger and was positioned where an explosion would cause maximum structural damage and civilian casualties. James had 1 shot at an impossible target from a distance that tested the limits of handgun accuracy. If he missed, hundreds of people would die in the explosion. If he hit the bomb instead of the terrorist, the device might detonate anyway. If he took too long to line up the shot, the terrorist would have time to trigger the explosive regardless of James's actions. But James Morrison had spent 18 years learning to make impossible shots under conditions where failure wasn't an option. He trained at FBI facilities with the best marksmen in federal law enforcement, practiced scenarios that tested human capabilities beyond normal limits, and developed the kind of precision that separated counter-terrorism agents from ordinary law enforcement officers. The final shot of James's career was the most important he'd ever made. At 43 yards, through a crowd of panicked civilians, While positioned at an angle that prevented collateral damage, he placed a single bullet with a precision that saved hundreds of lives and ended a terrorist attack that could have traumatized an entire region. Subject 3 collapsed without triggering the explosive device, which was immediately secured by federal bomb technicians who had finally reached the scene. The attack that had been planned to kill hundreds of American families was over, stopped by one man who'd recognized the threat and responded with skills that most people didn't know existed outside of movies. But for James, the real victory was smaller and more personal. The young mother and her 2 children emerged safely from the jewelry store office. The teenagers behind the fountain were unharmed. The elderly couple and their grandchildren were reunited with other family members who'd been evacuated during the early phases of the lockdown. 15,000 people had entered Westfield Shopping Center that Saturday morning. 15,000 people went home safely that evening, most of them never knowing how close they'd come to becoming casualties in an attack that would have changed their community forever. Federal agents secured the scene, documented evidence, and began the investigation that would eventually trace the terrorist cell back to an international network operating in 12 countries. But the immediate crisis was over, ended by a man who'd spent 6 years trying to forget everything he'd learned about protecting innocent people from those who wanted to kill them. 3 months later, James stood in the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., receiving the FBI Director's Award for Exceptional Service. But his thoughts weren't on official recognition. He was thinking about the families who'd been protected by someone who'd been willing to risk everything to ensure their safety. After the ceremony, FBI Assistant Director Sarah Chen offered James a new position, Community Security Liaison, placing retired agents in civilian positions where they could provide early warning for threats that traditional law enforcement might not detect. James accepted, understanding that some people were meant to serve in ways that didn't require recognition or official status. 6 months later, residents of a small college town began noticing their new school security coordinator, a quiet man who seemed unusually well informed about emergency procedures. The Westfield attack had been prevented not by advanced technology or unlimited resources, but by one person who'd been watching, someone who'd been trained, and someone who'd been willing to act when action was necessary. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like James? Someone whose ordinary job was actually preparation for an extraordinary moment? Share their story in the comments, because quiet guardians like that deserve to be remembered. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Heroes. We're here to honor the people who serve without asking for recognition, who understand that real heroism happens when someone stands between innocent people and those who would harm them. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the person checking receipts at the mall exit has spent decades learning to protect much more than store merchandise.